This evening, the secrets of the Black Museum.
The Black Museum is Scotland Yard's Chamber of Crime. It was opened in 1874 purely for the purposes of instructing police officers on what burglary was about. Within a year, it had grown to cover every type of crime committed within the Metropolitan Police. The heads were introduced into the museum to show detectives what criminals looked like. They were originally made by phrenologists who believed if you had a lump here and a bump there, you could identify criminal traits. Every one of them that you see has been hanged, and they have the hanging marks around the neck. 31st of August, 1888. At about 3:45 in the morning, they found the body of Polly Nichols. Throat cut, mutilation of the lower abdomen. A week goes by, it's the 8th of September. At about 6:05 in the morning, they found the body of Annie Chapman. Face cut, throat cut, mutilation of the lower abdomen. 3 weeks go by, it's the 30th of September, and there's a double event. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, Liz Stride is found with her throat cut, nothing else. And then, at about 1 to 2 in the morning, they found the body of Catherine Eddowes. Her face cut, throat cut, and mutilation of the lower abdomen. Lord Mayor's Day in 1888. About 1 o'clock, the buzz went round the crowd that they found another victim, Mary Jane Kelly. On the 25th of September, a letter was received at the Central News Agency, signed Jack the Ripper. Now, that was the first time that name was used, and it's that name that's synonymous with that type of crime wherever you go in the world. I think that those crimes were committed, at least 4 of those crimes were committed by the same person, at least 4 of them. He did exist, but probably not in the way that everybody mentally pictures him. The mental picture of the Ripper is not what he was about. He would be somebody who was fairly low-key, fairly normalized in everyday life. It is possible, and as we found in many cases, possible he was married, possible he had children. But he was a man who had that deep-seated need to go out and kill to gain sexual satisfaction, and that's just what he did. It's often said there's a set of records kept here and a set of records at the Home Office that tell us who it is. That's a nonsense. At least if they do exist, I've never seen them. I can certainly say that we do not keep a set of records here at New Scotland Yard that tell us who Jack the Ripper was. We do not know. We never solved it.
Yes, here we are, in loving memory of
Ralph John Jocelyn.
who was fatally wounded on January the 23rd, 1909, aged 10 years, erected by his fellow scholars at Earlsmead School. A very cold winter's morning in January 1909. About 10:30 in the morning. And as was usual at Schneerman's rubber factory in Chestnut Road, Tottenham, the wages were driven from the bank in Hackney back towards the factory by the owner's chauffeur. Two young Russians were either side of the factory entrance gates, each armed with a self-loading pistol of European make, something that in itself was unknown outside perhaps the military in this country at the time. They carried, again, this was quite a common thing with these anarchists when they did any of these robberies. They carried a lot of ammunition. It was subsequently found that perhaps they fired anything up to 400 rounds of ammunition during the ensuing chase. The police, a matter of yards away in the station, realized that something was on. Two PCs came out of the front door to see the two Russians running down Chestnut Road towards the railway line and to Tottenham Marshes. From then on, really, the chase and what I would describe as a hue and cry began. They actually came into Mitchley Road, where they reloaded, and the car literally turned the corner just as they'd finished reloading. And the people in the car were presented with a hail of bullets. Unfortunately, a 10-year-old boy received a stray bullet, and it was fatal. They actually passed along quite a high wall of the local dust destructor, which we would call the council depot these days. And there, PC Tyler got within about 30 yards. Paul Hayfeld turned and fired one shot.
The chase, which had become most desperate, was continued with a splendid determination. The murderers proceeded over the footbridge spanning the Great Eastern Railway and then in a northeasterly direction to the west bank of the River Lee.
Now, they got to Salisbury Hall Farm. Hayfeld and Jacob took refuge behind a haystack, again firing at will at anybody who came within range. They then decided to make a break for it. A tram that had left Chingford on its way to the Baker's Arms at Leighton was trundling up the road.
Without a moment's hesitation, they commandeered an electric tram en route to the Baker's Arms, Lee Bridge Road. The driver stopped the car and rushed upstairs, leaving the conductor, who was forced, with the muzzle of the revolver at his head, to go to the controller and drive them with all speed. Also at this point, they were holding at bay a large crowd of pursuers.
They're exhausted. And Jacob successfully got over a wooden fence to a building site. Hayfeld couldn't manage the fence, being the much heavier set man, and he only had 2 bullets left, and he could see the policeman gaining on him, and he shot himself. Jacob then made across some open ground into a particular very small cottage called Oak Cottage, an early 19th century 2-up, 2-down cottage. They went up to the first floor bedroom where they knew Jacob had taken refuge.
At this juncture, PC 636 Charles Eagles and PC Charles Dixon CID rendered their service. Eagles fired twice and Cater once through the panel of the door.
Forensic evidence later, the coroner's court bore out the fact that Jacob in fact shot himself. One shot finished him off, and in fact he was dead by the time they actually took him out into the street.
1910, Dr. Crippen. Dr. Crippen murdered his wife, Bella Elmore, and he buried her in the basement of 39 Hilldrop Crescent. That's the shovel he used to dig up the basement, and it's pretty certain it was the same shovel used by the Metropolitan Police some months later when they dug it all up again. He killed his wife because he'd been having an affair with his typist, Ethel the Knave. Dr. Crippen at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, Camden Town, murdered his wife, and then he left with his mistress Ethel the Knave and went over to Belgium, where he caught a boat over to Canada. Captain Kendall on the SS Montrose was rather suspicious of a man and his son, apparently. Being suspicious of them, he sent a telegram back to London. Now, what is interesting about this case is this is the first crime solved using wireless telegraph.
Have strong suspicion that Crippen, London cellar murderer, and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Moustache taken off, growing beard. Accomplice dressed as boy. Voice, manner, and build undoubtedly a girl. Both travelling as Mr. and Master Robinson.
Chief Inspector Dew caught a faster packet, and he went over to Canada and intercepted the boat off Father Point. And Crippen and Ethel the Knave were brought back to this country to stand trial. They went into 39 Hilldrop Crescent and dug up the basement and took out what was left of Mrs. Crippen. They didn't find a lot. They found some flesh samples with scar tissue on them. They found some hair, but they also found a pajama jacket. And it was that pajama jacket that convicted Crippen. On the fourth day of the trial, Crippen was asked whether he'd purchased any pajamas from Jones Brothers at Holloway. He said he had. He was asked when. He said 1905. The next witness went into the box and said Jones Brothers Holloway, as on the tiny little label on the pajama jacket, had become a limited company in 1906, proving that Crippen was lying. At the end of the day, it was the pajama jacket that convicted Crippen. Ethel the Knave, after Crippen had been found guilty, Ethel the Knave stood trial. The case lasted 1 day and she was released. Flannelfoot's name came because he wore overshoes and old socks on his feet when he went burgling. In somewhere around about 1932, he started to operate in the London area. He used to catch the underground train and go to all sorts of places on the outskirts of London. And when he got there, he'd steal a bicycle. His skills as a burglar were quite remarkable because his material, what he carried, was very, very simple indeed. He didn't have a massive lot of gear like jemmies and drills. He had very small, compacted stuff, which was very easy to hide. The keys were for opening the mortise locks, a set of lock picks which he could put in and, with a bit of luck, open the lock.
Gonna turn my back on love, gonna stop the moon above, seal all my windows up within, so the love bug can't get in, gonna park my romance right along the hang a sign up on my heart.
He'd go to the house, and when he got there, he'd drill through the window frame with the wood aug and the gimlet, take a knife, slip the catch, up the window and in. Now, he always worked at weekends, and he only took money. Never took any personal property. So he's a very difficult man to catch. And he went on like this for 5 years. The police were frantic about it. They had a massive, great map in map room which showed where he went to, where a bicycle was found, and so on and so forth. And they kept putting out random groups to try and catch him. They caught him purely by luck one night when they got a team working out somewhere. They saw the man steal the bicycle. He was caught, and they now had him inside. He went down for 5 years, and when he came up, he moved up to Northampton, where he worked for a while, and he died of TB some 5 years later. Never committed another offence. Now, he's an interesting man because police in the 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s were taught what burglary was all about, using flannel foot as an example. John George Haigh, the acid bath murderer, is unique in the annals of murder because he's one of the few murderers that actually practiced before he actually committed the crime. He took a Mrs. Durand Deacon down to Leopold Road at Crawley, shot her with the gun. Wearing the gas mask, apron and gloves, he put her head first into that drum at the back. Now, it was not a bath. It's called the acid bath murder, but it was an oil drum, a 40-gallon oil drum, specially treated to withstand acid. He then pumped in concentrated sulfuric acid, put the body in there, wearing the gas mask, the apron, the gloves, and the other bits and pieces. And if you put a body in acid, within 48 hours, you would have reduced it to a sludge. At the end of 48 hours, you'd have a drum that was half filled with sludge, which would be the human tissue, the body tissue, which would also include the skeletal frame, half filled with quiescent acid. And interestingly enough, at the top, you would have 2 to 3 inches of body fat. Body fat will not dissolve in acid. Now, what he did now, he took the drum out the back, scooped off the fat. You can see traces of it on the apron there. Dumped that, and then he kept pumping in cold acid over probably a 7-day period. That reduced the skeletal frame to a sludge. The plastic handbag. Interestingly, I had a relation of this dear lady, and he said she was known to the family as the woman with the plastic handbag. And it was one of the first plastic handbags to come over here. And forensically, it was the first time we realized that plastic does not dissolve in acid. Haigh had experimented by dissolving mice in acid, but found it impossible to get rid of Mrs. Deacon's handbag, false teeth, and gallstones. Keith Simpson, the pathologist, came here, and the first thing he found when he looked down on the ground, which in those days was all gravel, were the gallstones. Now, the gallstones are green and they're faceted, and they are different to gravel, and he saw that and immediately identified that, of course, they were looking at human remains. They also found the false teeth of Mrs. Durand Deacon, which was identified from dental records, and a calcined left foot, which belonged to her. John George Haigh pleaded that he was insane. The idea was that he wouldn't be hanged, of course, but the judge would not have that, and he was charged with murder as a sane person found guilty and sentenced to death. Christie was a war reserve at Harrow Road Police Station. He was dismissed from the job for interfering with women in the canteen there. John Reginald Halliday Christie walked away from 10 Rillington Place somewhere about March the 19th, 1953, and he left behind a tomb. A man took up residence 4 days later, Beresford Brown, pulled back the paper on the corner of a door in the kitchen, and there he saw the body of a woman sitting on a pile of ashes. That was Hectorina McLennan. When they had a good look at it, behind that was a Miss Maloney, behind that was a Miss Nilsson. All of them had been strangled. All of them had evidence of carbon monoxide poisoning. And all of them had evidence of sexual intercourse at the time of death, shortly before or shortly afterwards. Women came to Christie's house at 10 Rillington Place for the purpose of him carrying out abortions. But of course, he was a necrophiliac. There is little doubt that he had intercourse with them. Under the floorboards in the front room, the body of Mrs. Christie. In the garden, they started to dig. They found the remains of Miss Ruth first. There's the thoracic vertebrae first, with the root growing through it. And also the remains of Miss Muriel Edith. They disappeared in 43 and 44, respectively. From a very clever piece of forensic patching, they identified the teeth from dental records. They'd been shown as missing persons. They were now well on the trail of this man. He had disappeared. He was seen down at Putney Bridge, and he was arrested there by a PC Ledger and taken into the police station.
I noticed Christie facing this way up the river and crossed the road and interrogated him. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was looking for work. And I asked him then his name and address, and he gave me a false name and address in Notting Hill. I smelt a rat immediately then when he said Notting Hill, because that's where the murders took place.
That's right.
So I asked him to take his hat off, which he did, and in his hair was some little leaves and twigs. Obviously, he'd been sleeping rough, this man, and I decided that this was Christie. I pulled out the Daily Mail and had a look at the photograph, and told him that I thought he was John Reginald Halliday Christie. I was going to detain him for inquiries. I took him into the Putney police station and put a PC in charge of him in the charge room. I went into the office, and the sergeant looked at the identity card, which he thought had been property found in the street.
But he didn't believe you, did he?
Well, I said, I've got a man out here, belongs to this card. I said, blimey, he just jumped over the counter and into the charge room.
In those days, that area was a whole mass of criminals. I remember one instance, I chased a man from, I'd seen stealing some produce from a shop on the corner of St. Mark's Road, quite close to Rillington Place. I chased him back into 10 Rillington Place and made the arrest upstairs in Christie's house. And I remember going back to Christie and telling him that I'd arrested one of his tenants. And at that time I said to him, what a rotten smell there is in your house, Christie. And he said to me, it's all those blooming tenants upstairs. And I didn't realize at that time that I was standing in the front room with his mouldering wife underneath the floorboards where we were standing.
Can you remember the house? It was divided into 3 flats, and Christie had the down floor flat.
That's right, yes.
And as you came out of the back door into the garden, you came past the wash house, where we found bodies in the Evans case.
Yes, behind a lot of old timber stacked up against the outside loo door. It was there that I found this little interesting exhibit on a heap of rubbish swept up just outside the back door underneath the back room window, I found this little gold leaf tobacco tin, which looked rather clean and new compared with the rest of the rubbish. So I picked it up, opened it, and inside I found a lot of little clippings of hairs, and I had my suspicions. Eventually proved to be pubic hair clippings from quite a number of bodies.
Christie was tried for the murder of his wife, found guilty, sentenced to death and hanged at Pentonville. John Reginald Halliday Christie was, up until Nilsson, the worst mass murderer of this century.
On June the 21st, Ruth Ellis was found guilty of murder at the Old Bailey and sentenced to death in accordance with the law. On July the 13th, she was executed. But Britain's conscience was uneasy.
She'd had an affair with a chap called Blakely. They'd been together for some years. Blakely came from a pretty good family. He played around with racing cars, not particularly successfully, but he played around with them. And she was a hostess from a club in Kensington. Gradually, slowly but surely, the thing blew up into an impasse. He, at some time, had a long affair with her, and then he left her, and she kept coming back and trying to get him to come back to her. And then, one day, she went to the Magdala public house, where he was having a drink. He came out of the pub, and she fired 6 shots into him with a gun behind me here.
Shooting took place, and Ruth Ellis, if I remember right, was brought into the station by the wireless car, and that's where I first sort of took charge of her, sort of thing. Sat her down in the CID office. And she had a cigarette, and she was absolutely and completely calm, chatting away. And I formed the impression then, and very much confirmed later, that she just really couldn't care what was going to happen to her. She wanted to shoot him, she shot him, and she was quite happy to have done so.
She was quite composed about the whole thing.
Absolutely, quite calm,
yes.
And more calm than we were, I suppose.
Yeah. She convicted herself out of her own mouth. When asked whether she intended to shoot Blakely, she said yes. When asked whether she fired the gun that killed Blakely, she said yes. The guilty mind, the guilty act that are needed in murder to prove murder were there, and that was the end of it.
I had a fair amount to do with her, because in those days, in the days of capital punishment, it was incumbent upon police to pick up the prisoner at the prison, take her to court at Hampstead, and take her back to the prison. Well, I had that job, and I used to sit in the back of the car, WPC with her, and just chat away about things in general. Right about us married and children and that sort of thing. That's what they were taken to a tea party.
Millions are asking, is it civilized to kill by law? Does it really act as a deterrent? Is it right to ask any human being to carry out the killing? And if the law says that it is, should it be set aside merely because the murderer is a woman?
In the 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s, all the women hanged had a certain amount of sympathy attached to them. And when it comes down to the abolition of the death penalty, I think it was a whole series of events. There was a general feeling that the death penalty should be abolished. August the 8th, 1963. The Great Train Robbery. About 3 o'clock in the morning, they stopped the mail train coming down to Euston from Scotland at Sears Crossing. They faked the lights up, faked them from green to red. The train stops. 15 criminals get on the train, and they unload 121 bags of used notes and put them on lorries that they prepared. They drive helter-skelter across the country to a farm called Leatherslade Farm. At Leatherslade Farm, they wait. After 5 days, they've shared out the money, some £150,000 each, and they break. They go all over the place. Police officers and the fingerprint department go into the train to take prints. Fingerprint team go into Leatherslade Farm and they remove the prints. They had prints on tomato ketchup. Mr. Big's prints are on the tomato ketchup bottle. We took prints off draft bitter cans. They tried to disguise their fingerprints by putting tape around their fingers. It didn't work, it was too hot, it kept coming off.
Even though it's 25 years ago, I can remember as though it was yesterday. They stuffed a pair of leather gloves over the green light about 3/4 of a mile up there on the gantry at Sears Crossing. Put two 12-volt batteries on the red light, stopped the train, uncoupled the high-value package coach, which was immediately behind the locomotive, and just drove it down here, stopped exactly opposite this wall here, tacked it with axes, etc. Took about 10 minutes, quarter hour to get in there. Then they just made a human chain and passed 120 mailbags, which contained in value 2,600,000 and weighed over 2 ton, they reckon. This team spent months preparing it, and you can see, to go and find a location like this near the main line, the time had to be bang on. And again, people didn't realise at the time, but they'd even selected a farm out of Leatherslade, which is a good 20 minutes drive, which is almost the opposite direction to London. So as soon as a scream went up from somebody dialing 999 and saying a train's been stopped and millions are stolen, we'd have had roadblocks up down in the M1, etc. It was all open in those days. So they'd gone right to the last detail on this planning. We wouldn't have been looking out in a farmhouse somewhere.
Here it is, Jack, Leatherslade Farm, where they came to. They were well isolated. It was well selected, wasn't it? Clever place to pick.
Unbelievable. You can't even see it from the bottom road. When you go along the main road at the bottom, it's only about 400 yards. It's just down below the level of the horizon there. You've got to go 3/4 of a mile up there before you get a glimpse of it.
They were well holed up there, weren't they? They've got stores to last for a long, long time.
They planned it for about a fortnight. Tins of beans, the old favourites, were easy to cook. Sleeping bags, 7-pint cans of beer. I have to tell you what, not only was it one of the heaviest crimes we've ever had, but I think it's the best planned one as well.
Of course, they were given massive sentences. Very few of them served the full term. Biggs, he escaped, went to South America. He can't come back, or he'll be sent to prison for the crime he committed in 1963. This is the usual police team. Foxtrot 11 is going about its business trying to catch criminals, and they go down Braybrook Street and they see this car. They pull it.
Hey, pull over!
Chris Head, Sergeant Head, and Wombwell came back to speak.
Are you the owner of this car?
Yeah.
Can I see your road fund licence?
I haven't got one. I can't get it taxed till I get the MOT done.
Driving licence, then. You do realise
They probably stopped the car to find out what it was doing, cruising so near to the prison.
Rake, I was nicked, but it's a fortnight ago.
You've got to get it sorted out.
Right. Name.
A transporter recovered the police car and a manhunt began.
We've got to call all COC8 units, which is flying squad units, contact the yard immediately, urgent. There had been a very serious assault on 3 police officers at Shepherd's Bush in Braybrook Street. And we were to come back to the yard and wait there to be briefed. The people in Shepherd's Bush, I've never seen the feeling like it before, because the same night it happened, they were queuing up to give donations, bringing flowers. You couldn't move because Jeff Fox was a really local bloke, and he was a good guy. You know, he was one of those help anybody, help the neighbours, done anything. In fact, all 3 were good guys, but Jeff was so well known that the public went over the top.
Federation has suggested that capital punishment should be reintroduced for murder of policemen. Is there any question of your reconsidering the Home Office position on this?
Well, I can well understand the reaction and feelings of policemen at the present time, but it would be quite wrong for me to take a major policy decision in the shadow of one event, however horrible that may be.
John Duddy and John Edward Whitney were caught almost immediately.
Duddy's reaction, see, up there, he said he was there but never done any shooting. But when we got him back on the plane, he was travelling back on the plane with Hensley, we had him in an apartment of our own and had him under a raincoat, but he was so hot, you know, it was hot weather. He asked if we could have it off, so I sat him on the floor. And then seeing he was being treated quite with gentlemen's, you know, with kid gloves, for some reason I think his conscience got the better of him, and suddenly he said to me, look, it was me, I got out of the car, Robert said shoot, shoot, and I grabbed a gun and shot the driver. And from that moment onwards, he just put his hands up.
Harry Roberts was leader of the gang then, wasn't he?
He was the leader of the gang without doubt. They were a cheap little team. They were every day run-of-the-mill. And Roberts had been in the army, sitting up in trees, somewhere where there was some battle going on, and he used to sit in a tree and keep observation for day in, day out, and was awarded a medal for his efforts.
A massive operation was mounted to find Roberts. Large numbers of policemen, dogs, helped by helicopters, were employed to track him down.
When we found him, he dug a tent into the middle of a woods about a foot deep and was living out there for weeks and weeks on his own.
Roberts, Duddy and Whitney were given life sentences with a recommendation to serve a minimum of 30 years. Duddy has since died in prison. A man was standing on the south side of Waterloo Bridge. He felt a blow in the thigh, turned round, saw a man pick up an umbrella. The man got in a taxi and drove away. Georgy Markov got on a bus, went over to Bush House where he was working. and complained to a friend that his right leg was very stiff. Georgi Markov was a Bulgarian working for the World Service of the BBC. He had defected from his home country some 7 years previously, and in addition to his BBC work, he was broadcasting for the German station Deutsche Welle and the American-backed Radio Free Europe. They had a look at the back of his right leg and found here what was later described as an angry red spot. He didn't pay too much attention to that. He went home that night, said to his wife that he didn't feel too well, and the doctor was called, and the doctor said, flu, he's got flu. Put him in bed, he'll be all right in the morning. But the following morning, he was not all right. The following morning, he was a very poorly man indeed. The doctor was called back and re-diagnosed septicemia, blood poisoning. And as the day went on, his condition worsened to such an extent that he had to be admitted to St. James's Hospital at Balham, and he was a very sick man indeed.
At the post-mortem, things were a bit of a mystery. There was just this wound, which really looked like the site of an insect bite, with reddening around a very tiny hole. And nothing was found there, but that part of his anatomy was preserved for further examination, and in fact was taken to Porton Down, the chemical research establishment there. Down there, Dr. David Gall found this tiny little pellet on the surface of the skin, and we were shown photographs taken with the assistance of microscopes, and the pellet had these two tiny little holes traversing the centre. Inquiries did continue for a number of years, but gradually all leads sort of petered out. I wouldn't say the case was closed by any means, but certainly it's not an active inquiry at this moment in time.
Dennis Nilsson lived at 23 Cranley Gardens, and he, along with others in a converted semi-detached house, complained of a smell in the drains, and along came the plumber, swept the drains and brought out 2 buckets of what he thought were very odd bits and pieces. He phoned his manager, and his manager said, oh, we'll leave that, we'll deal with that tomorrow morning. When they went back the following morning, the buckets had disappeared. Not to be outdone, the plumber was down the drain again, and he brought out some more bits. They were taken down to the mortuary, and there David Bowen, the pathologist, Professor Bowen, said they were probably human flesh boiled and cut up.
Not only did he say that it was human remains, he said to me, your victim's been strangled. And I wondered whether he was pulling my leg to begin with. But sure enough, he pointed out this one particular piece of flesh, and he said, look, it's come from a human neck, and there's a ligature mark on it. So that gave me quite a good start, because I knew that when I finally came face to face with this character Nielsen later on in the afternoon, I knew that I was dealing with a murder case. And when he came through the door, he was Mr. Average. He looked like your average office worker. I introduced myself and lightly said to him, I've come about your drains. He wanted to know why I was so interested in his drains, and I said, well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you. And we went up into the flat, and I said they were blocked with human remains. And he said, oh my God, how awful. And I said, don't mess about, where's the rest of the body? And he said, it's in 2 plastic bags in the other room.
We found blood traces in the bath which indicated that he'd used the bath for the purposes of probably cutting up some of the bodies. And also we found blood traces on the stove, body fat, hair, bits of flesh.
I never thought of anything more than one body at that stage, and it was a chance remark by my deputy Steve McCusker on the way back to the police station, when Steve said to him, are we talking about 1 body or 2? And Nielsen said 15. Or in fact, I think he said 16 to begin with. It later transpired that it was 15. And the curious thing was the fact that we believed him straight away. There was no reason to think, you know, he's talking out of the back of his neck. He was being honest with us right from the start.
The search for the bodies led police to Melrose Avenue, Nilsen's former home, where police cadets searched the garden and a piece of waste ground at the rear for human remains. So when did Nelson first move in here, Peter?
He moved in November 1975. He moved in with a fellow called, well, he affectionately called him Twinkle. He was a homosexual friend, and they lived together for about 18 months here. And when Twinkle left, he had a relationship with another couple of guys over an 18-month period. And then round about 1978, I think it was December 1978, one of his potential flatmates came back here with him and didn't leave. He was victim number 1.
So how many did he kill here?
He killed 12 in all, over a period of about 4 years, I think. And he stored their bodies in that ground floor room where the French doors are. He kept about 4 or 5 at a time underneath the floorboards until there wasn't room to put another one in there. So he'd have to pull them out, and then he'd get rid of them on a bonfire in the back garden. He had 3 fires in all, 2 in the garden and 1 out here on this wasteland. He said in one particular paper that the victim is the dirty platter after the feast, and the washing up was a clinically ordinary task. We couldn't find a motive for it. The only thing that we could come up with was the fact that he invited people home because he hoped somebody was going to stay with him. And every time, or nearly every time, at the end of a good drink, at the end of an evening, his visitor would get up and go away. And on 15 occasions, this was too much for him. And he killed, and on more than one occasion, he left his victim sitting in a chair, upright, but dead. And maybe he thought, coming home from work the next day, albeit he's dead, there's somebody to come home to. I don't know.
He came to court and he pleaded guilty by virtue of diminished responsibility. That states that I'm mad when I kill, but I'm perfectly sane before and afterwards, but the judge would not accept that. And he was arraigned on the first charge of murder, found guilty, and sent down for 25 years.
He wrote, "It amazes me that I have no tears for myself. I have no tears for my victims, nor those bereaved by my actions."
We go back to where we began, with Jack the Ripper. This is very much a museum in action, and last year we received a brown envelope containing papers relating to the Ripper files. They didn't give us any answers to who Jack the Ripper was, except that important papers like the Dear Boss letter, the original, were returned to us. If you pull the file, read the file on Jack the Ripper, you'll find in there a set of papers. They're called the MacNaughton Notes. They were made by MacNaughton, the commissioner, some 5 years later. And he identifies 3 people. He identifies a man called Ostrog, Dr. Ostrog, a man called Kosminski, both of them with homicidal tendencies, both of them admitted to lunatic asylums. But it's the third one that intrigues detectives, and that's a man called Druitt, Montague Druitt. From the point of view of the detective and the circumstantial evidence, Druitt is the best bet. Whether we'll ultimately manage to find out who it is, I very much doubt. Unless another brown envelope turns up at the yard with more papers in it that nobody has ever seen before.